Okay, so time for us to move into Angular. And this is going to be a framework that we're going to take a look at. And it's worth doing a little bit of context, although I think you have some context by the fact that you ended up building a single page application without a framework. So that if you start thinking about Trip Planner, you compare your code to somebody else's, you'd see that there's any number of ways that these things ended up getting implemented. And you also see that there's definitely this um, uh, trend or a likelihood that as you build this out, you see that your code gets to look like spaghetti, no matter how much you sort of break it up. And we spoke about this a little bit, but there's no real um, opinions with jQuery. It's not really a framework. It's a tool for uh, uh, interacting with the DOM. So let's just sort of go back a little bit and talk about the history of the internet a little bit. So this is the what's considered the first web page. And so you really just had this page that really allowed you to get to other documents. All it was, you could sort of think about it pretty much as an online document browser. You also, had a history of, all kinds of wacky graphics and different browsers implementing different CSS styles that would sort of drive people crazy. So pages that had sort of things spinning around and marquees and that sort of thing. Um, so at that point, right, really, what you had was that you had these documents, you had some styling with CSS, you had some images, but again, you really just ended up having pages that ended up getting linked together. And there's a term for this. If you created a website for someone, early on, it was basically you would end up taking whatever their printed brochure was, and you would end up turning it into a website. So you have this term brochureware. So what ends up happening is that eventually the browser becomes a lot more powerful, and you have the ability to create applications within the browser. And we spoke about this, where you have interactive applications like Gmail and Google Maps, and the fact that you don't have these page refreshes all the time, and you have, the user can interact with the application. And in fact, the browser becomes this mature application platform. And really, you end up writing software in the browser. And this whole entire thing is driven by JavaScript. And the reason why it's driven by JavaScript is JavaScript was the language of the browser. So if you're going to have your browser running your application, that's the language that you're going to end up using. And so when you start actually not building web pages or brochureware, you're building software. And there's a couple things that are very important about software. It's got to be easily understood. You should be able to look into it and look at the code and understand what's going on. It should be easy to maintain. You don't want to end up building it once, and then when you decide to make modifications to it, you have to throw it out and rebuild it. You want it to be able to scale. So we could talk about scaling as in the application getting bigger, or scaling as in terms of more users using the application. And most important, it has to work. So you sort of saw the kind of wild west of application development I mentioned before by looking at Trip Planner and the idea that your code could get out of control in a very short order of time. I mean, the Trip Planner was not uh, an incredibly complex application, but just sort of moving things from one drop-down list to the other, disabling them in the drop-down list, moving between days. You saw how your code could end up getting a lot more complex, and it sort of when you look at it, it sort of cried out to say, "Hey, look, how can I separate this out further?" How do I maybe separate out the DOM from my business logic and that sort of thing. And that's really where frameworks end up coming in. So we're going to talk about Angular. We'll actually I'm going to set up a little demo so you can see it in action, take some of the mystery out of it. But in essence, what it does is it's providing this generic functionality and environment. So right off the bat, you have things in Angular, and Angular is just a JavaScript file really, but you have methods in Angular that you could end up using where you can end up reusing functionality. So this is also the generic functionality. It's not that much different from jQuery. The difference is that it's forcing you to write code in an environment. So things are being broken up, and so it's very opinionated about how an application should be set up. And it ends up establishing this pattern and architecture. So again, like if we looked at Trip Planner, we said, hey, look, it would be great if we sort of separated out maybe our trip from what our view is, and maybe be able to pass our trip into some view and have the view render itself. This is really, in essence, what Angular ends up doing. And it allows you to sort of not have to worry about structuring your code as much and be concerned about what's product specific. So, the idea that, a trip, a day on a trip has to have, at least 2 restaurants, or you can only have 1 hotel, or that sort of thing. It's stuff that's, you could focus on your business logic as opposed to focusing, on the patterns of your code. So it ends up being a pretty good solution to a lot of problems that you'll end up running into. So let's actually start here by setting up a sort of simple Angular application. So I'm going to go over here. I have this empty folder here, and I'm going to do a bower init. And here's my bower init. Here I've just got my bower file. Make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to say bower install Angular. By default, this is going to put this in a bower components folder. And I'll end up grabbing this. And I'm going to open this up and create a web page very simply with Angular. So if we end up letting this thing load, popping this open, and if we look at let's see if this is downloaded yet. So here are bower components, and here's our Angular. So I'm going to just create a simple page, and this is going to be my HTML, and here's my head, body, right? The proverbial hello Angular. All right, we don't have Angular here yet, but we'll put it in shortly. So what I want to do here is I'm going to start a server from this folder. So if you haven't never done this, there's a npm module called HTTP server. And if you're in a directory, it'll basically start a server and allow you to serve up static files. So let's do that. Again, we're not even really talking about Express at this point. Now I've got my server. And if I go to it over here, browse to it, here's our old trip planner. And here's my hello Angular. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, within the head of my document, I'm going to say script source / bower components angular.js. In which case we've got Angular here, and if on the next line I end up doing a console log, I'll see that we have this Angular object in the global namespace. So now, if we go back here, and I reload this, I'll see that I have Angular, and here are all the things that Angular can do. So, and again, it might not look, there's a bunch of things here. It's not incredible how long this list is, but this is an object that's going to give us the ability to create a module. And that's going to be sort of our starting point with Angular. So what we're going to do here is instead of just doing Angular console.log, Angular, I'm going to create an Angular app. And the way that you do it is by saying Angular module. Now, when you're creating an app, you could give your app a name. I'm going to call mine my app. There's a second parameter that's important. This second parameter has to do with any dependencies in your application, any other modules that you're bringing in that should be available within this application. But once I end up doing this, I could actually see that I've got an app. It's not really going to mean all that much for us right now, but in fact, it is an application. In fact, I can see the name is my app. So once I have an Angular application, what I can do is in my code, I can use what's called an Angular directive. So Angular directives are attributes that you put on HTML elements, and the browser doesn't really have an understanding of it, but Angular does. And what happens is that after your DOM has loaded, Angular will go in and will basically parse out your DOM and look for the attributes that it is aware of. If it's not aware of, it'll just end up ignoring it. And so all of the Angular attributes are preceded by ng. And so if we go over here and we say ng app equals my app, that's going to be a very legal thing to do because my app has been created. Again, this will end up, it's not like you have to put this on the bottom or anything like that. What happens is that when the DOM loads, the browser will end up getting parsed by Angular, the DOM will get parsed by Angular, and it'll look for a module called my app, and it'll luckily find it. And the way we know that is that we don't have any errors. If I went back here and I did that, I'd get an error, and the error is going to say, hey, look, I don't really know what to do with this because I'm trying to look for a module, instantiate a module, and this does not exist. So we could go back here. Now, my sort of sanity check to make sure that Angular is working is that Angular will actually look for Angular expressions, okay? And this is going to look very similar to Swig, so it's kind of nice that we're able to use Swig. So if I go in here and actually put in a Angular expression like, let's say, 20 times 10. And if I end up reloading this, I'll see that I get 200. If, in fact, I didn't end up putting in this app here, the fact that I set up a module here, nothing is going to get parsed on the page. This is, my DOM is going to know nothing about this module. Angular is not going to operate on my DOM with anything because it doesn't see that there's an Angular application here. So here you just see your text. But again, here, if in fact I say ng app and I say my app, right, you could see that Angular is here. So one of the things that you're seeing here is this, what would be called templating, the fact that we could put expressions inside of here. And, we're not limited to this. We could, go over here and say, what if we said, math.random. So these are just expressions that can be evaluated. Let's try this, math.random to string. And let's figure that one out. Let's just make sure I'm doing this correctly. Math.random gives us a number. Let's try this. Yeah, so I think sort of what this shows a little bit is that you don't have either there's something wrong with this expression, which I'm not sure that there is, but we'd have to go and figure that out. I'm not terribly concerned about it. Again, sort of my sanity check is that you could either do something like this. This is a little bit safer, I guess. Right, string to uppercase. That'll work, right? We could say substring 0 to 1. That should give me an E, right? So you can see that you could actually put an expression in here. There's some limitations, but this is going to be something that's going to evaluate to a string. So that's sort of the basics in terms of getting an Angular app set up. And again, you can see it's fairly simplistic. It's just a question of pulling in Angular, creating an Angular module. And one other thing that I want to point out, and this has some similarity to something we've seen already. You could leave that out, okay? And this will still work. So I'm not doing anything with that variable. But if you wanted to grab your module back again, you could grab it back again by, if I say console.log Angular module, I could use it again. But if I just pass in the name of the module without the second parameter, that means I'm accessing the module as opposed to creating it. This creates the module. This accesses it. It's very, very similar with Mongoose's models. With Mongoose's models, you create the model by giving it a name and a schema. And if you just wanted to access the model, you could do it just with the name. So it's kind of a similar functionality here. And you can see that you end up getting your model back. So the next thing that I want to do is we're going to end up taking a look at how we can end up using scope and how important scope is with Angular.